Charles Manson.
All my feelings are good.
Vicious cult leader.
Beautiful, Charlie.
Master manipulator.
Why won't they let us testify?
How was he able to control the minds of seemingly innocent teenagers and compel them to kill?
It's certainly my feeling that Mr. Manson is sane.
And how can we understand his capacity for evil?
Only perfection you bring.
A scale exists to measure the darkest corners of human behavior. It weighs the criminal mind and the crime. From impulsive murderers to serial killers, this 22-point scale attempts to determine who are the most evil. Charles Manson. His name is synonymous with evil. His image seems to conjure our darkest fears, yet no one actually died by Manson's own hand. In 1969, he ordered a group of young middle-class Americans to go on a murder spree. Yet Manson was not at the crime scene. Other criminals have racked up higher body counts, committed more horrifying and unspeakable acts. Yet it is this scrawny little man who plagues our nightmares. Even after decades behind bars, why does Manson still inspire such fear? What can he reveal about the nature of evil? Dr. Michael Stone, a forensic psychiatrist at Columbia University in New York, created the 22-point scale of evil. For decades, he has been researching history's most dangerous killers in an attempt to quantify evil. Charles Manson presents a special challenge to Dr. Stone, deciphering a man who has come to represent pure evil.
The Manson murders are more than just horrible killings. They are unique crimes where young teenagers who had shown no history of violence were coerced by this evil cult leader. People feared if Manson could get these kids to kill, could he convince theirs to do the same? It is that fear Manson created which is the foundation of his evil nature.
Charles Manson has been in prison for almost 40 years and is not permitted to speak publicly. So, to examine Manson's capacity for evil, Dr. Stone turned his attention to the man who may understand Manson best, former Deputy District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi. He led the prosecution of Manson.
And I can tell you that from the moment that I was assigned to the case and looked at the evidence, I immediately sensed that we were not going to find the motive for these murders within the typical textbook on police science. It was going to be far out. And as it turned out, the motive was much more far out than I could have possibly imagined.
August the 9th, 1969. A gruesome crime shocked the city of Los Angeles.
It is difficult to find even one aspect of the crime which is not sensational or bizarre.
Police discovered film actress Sharon Tate, the pregnant wife of director Roman Polanski, and 4 others brutally murdered in Tate's Hollywood Hills home. The next morning, police found a second crime scene, this time in the Los Feliz section of LA. Wealthy store owners Lino and Rosemary LaBianca had been similarly slaughtered.
The murders were not discovered until about 8:30 the following morning. There were 102 stab wounds. 3 of the victims were also shot. There's no indication of who would have committed murders like this.
Lino and Rosemary were found, like victims the previous night, in a pool of blood. Both of them had pillowcases over their heads.
What we're talking about here is a nightmarish scene of murder and brutality that I don't even think you see things like this in horror movies.
At both scenes, the killers had left cryptic messages scrawled in their victims' blood. Police didn't know what could have triggered the massacre, but it was clear that the 2 incidents were linked.
There was all types of speculation at the time. Who possibly could have committed these murders?
You have to realize that these murders were bizarre and they're not going to have a garden variety type of motive.
One of the big things that went away from any conventional motive was the multiplicity of stab wounds. If you add them up both nights, we're talking about 169 stab wounds. Some of these wounds were post-mortem, meaning the victim had already died and the killers continued to stab. So what are you looking at? It stumped law enforcement for a long time.
For 3 months, investigators pursued many potential theories, but had no solid leads. Then, an unexpected phone call provided a breakthrough. In August 1969, Los Angeles police discovered 2 gruesome crime scenes. 7 people had been slaughtered, and the killers had left behind bizarre messages. For 3 months, investigators were baffled. Then, in November, they received an astounding phone call. A young woman confessed to the crimes. Deputy District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi had been assigned the case.
This former call girl, she calls in to the LAPD. She says there's this crazy girl, Susan Atkins, is telling these unbelievable stories, that she was a member of this family, a group of chosen people, and they were responsible for these Tate LaBianca murders.
Susan Atkins, known as Sadie, was a 21-year-old university dropout in police custody for car theft. She admitted to being part of the group that committed the murders.
Susan, would you answer a couple of questions for us?
She said it was to be the first step in a global race war, which the group called Helter Skelter, that would bring about the end of the world, with the Manson family emerging as leaders of the survivors. She shocked Bugliosi by implicating a handful of others. They were all white, middle-class youths living like hippies in the desert near LA. Along with Atkins, the group included Tex Watson, a former honors student and sports star, Leslie Van Houten, a former homecoming queen, and Patricia Krenwinkel, who had at one point wanted to become a nun.
The members, for the most part, came from average American homes, which made the murders all the more shocking and all the scarier. These were not people with typical backgrounds that you would expect to engage in mass murder. The family was a nomadic, gypsy-like group of people that just traveled around. Their lifestyle was sex orgies, LSD trips.
But despite Atkins' confession, Bugliosi was convinced that someone else had to be pulling the strings. Who could turn seemingly peaceful hippies into cold-blooded butchers? Susan Atkins pointed Bugliosi towards a leader they followed with unwavering devotion, a self-proclaimed savior who preached that the apocalypse was coming. His name, Charles Manson.
He was about 5 feet 2 inches tall. He was hunchback, long hair, a beard, scraggly looking, kind of slightly built. Certainly not an imposing figure, but I realized that if his co-defendants committed these murders, he had to be behind them.
But how and why did this career criminal compel young men and women to commit murder? As Dr. Stone examines Manson's past, he finds a life built on rejection and abandonment.
A deep and rage-filled hatred of society often stems from significant rejection endured at a young age.
Cincinnati, Ohio, in the heart of the American Midwest, 1934. Charles Manson was born an unwanted child to a 16-year-old runaway. The cycle of abandonment began almost immediately. Manson never knew his father. His mother would leave him for days or weeks at a time, dumping him off on anyone who would take the young boy, even complete strangers. She once traded him to a waitress for a pitcher of beer.
He is a non-entity, discarded by both family and society. And Manson is learning that the only way to get any recognition, which he needs to validate his existence, is to act out in an increasingly destructive manner.
By the age of 19, Charles Manson had been in and out of 7 different boys' homes and institutions. His crimes included car theft and armed robbery. By his mid-20s, he was serving a 10-year prison sentence for a parole violation. He was able to con prison guards into giving him plum jobs and special privileges. Manson possessed keen powers of observation. He could perceive people's desires and weaknesses and then played them to his advantage. By the time he was released from prison in 1967 at the age of 32, Manson had spent more than half his life in jails and institutions.
In prison, Manson had a captive audience that he could use to attract attention to himself. But in the outside world, he's nobody. So he starts looking for ways to satisfy his deep-seated narcissism and regain some sense of power. He has developed a deep hatred of the society that rejected him. So, when he is forced back into it, this spurs him to create a society of his own, one over which he holds complete dominion.
Upon leaving prison, Manson moved to San Francisco. Isolated with no money and few friends, he began socializing with young people in the hippie scene. He used drugs like LSD to manipulate them and convince them to follow him into what he called a greater life. He preyed upon those who were vulnerable and easy to influence. By August 1968, Charlie had developed a following of 24 men and women who lived with him on an abandoned movie set near Los Angeles. To learn how Manson first attracted and then broke down his followers, Dr. Stone interviewed a woman who had been a full-fledged member of the Manson family. But even before meeting Manson, Catherine Scher had experienced the mind-altering power of LSD.
I had a roommate that was very avant-garde, and she introduced me to the coffee houses and flamboyant way of living, and she introduced me to LSD. From my first trip on, they gave me a whole lot. I was this little child, barefoot, running around, just giggling and picking flowers and giving them to people. They started calling me the flower child.
So you really underwent a altered state of consciousness and mindset.
I became about 10 years old, yeah.
For a rather long
time, yeah.
Before meeting Manson, or?
Yes, yeah. And so everyone would take care of me, and you know, people would be discussing politics, and I'd go up to them and just smile at them and give them a flower.
Scher met Charles Manson in the summer of 1968 when she was 25 years old.
Charlie came up in a car and said, "Hey, let's all go swimming." He looked me straight in the eyes and pierced my eyes and said, "This is your dream, girl. Start living it." And I was fascinated. I was definitely fascinated. He said that I belonged with him and that we were one, and pulled me in immediately. Mm-hmm. I never left. Everybody was drawn to him. He just pulled you in. He became whatever you needed him to be.
So what do you think it was about him that conferred that power?
One-on-one with you, he would be very caring, would work on your inadequacies, your needs, help you take away your fears. He was more than just fascinating. We felt that he had a corner on the truth. Charlie talked to whoever he was talking to in the way that they would believe him. Mm-hmm. So if he was talking to hippies, he'd talk one way. If he was talking to motorcycle guys, he'd talk another way. He can just reflect whatever he draws out of people, whatever he knows that they will agree with.
He also have sessions where he spoke at great length or for rather long periods of time or after hours, so that there was more of a deluge of his speech coming across to you, or was it happening in dribs and drabs?
Every single night we'd have dinner together. We'd have big bowls of food that we just passed around in a circle, and we'd smoke grass and we'd sing, and his songs were full of hypnotic, leave your mind far behind you, now is where you should be, very hypnotic, for hours.
Okay.
For hours. And we're just soaking in all this what we thought this truth and knowledge. People still go visit him and come out and think, he's a lot, I mean, you know, I really like him. He's a lot like me.
Do you know whether he tried with any of his group members to get them to do things, sexual or otherwise, that would tend to bind them to him in a special way by virtue of participating in something that was so outlandish that it would serve as a bind?
Well, he used sex, but no, not in that way. What he did is he got women to give up their control and become one with him. And so he knew how to do that. So that was almost like a drug, you know, the sex part.
Now, you mentioned already some of the ways in which Manson was able to indoctrinate a certain group of vulnerable people, you know, his charisma, the sex, and so on. There was also a way in which he would have people imitate his movements or gestures. Was that another?
It wasn't imitating. It was becoming one with him, being him. He was saying there's only one man. We wanted to be that one, and we wanted to, we weren't imitating him, we were trying to be that one. We were trying to be Charlie.
Manson used the mind-altering drugs and sex to make his followers more receptive to his control. He methodically broke down their sense of self. More and more, Manson targeted vulnerable white middle-class kids. Susan Atkins, 19. Patricia Krenwinkel, 20. Leslie Van Houten, 18.
They were younger. It was easier for Charlie just to wipe out the thoughts that they had. They were more pliable. He'd say, thinking is stinking. Don't think anymore. Be like a little child. Be like me. If you even wanted to question or talk about anything, you couldn't do it because you weren't supposed to think.
As his cult expanded, Manson tightened his grip.
When you isolate someone or a group of people, and there's no newspapers, there's no television, there's no parents, there's no family, he becomes, you know, the newscaster, the prophet, the, you know, father, mother, everything.
Did he think of himself as godlike in some way, or a special being?
He never had to say so. He was real good at letting you come to that conclusion. Mm-hmm. I just thought that he had a clear line to God, and God spoke through him. That's what I thought.
Manson instilled in his followers a fear of society and a fanatical desire for the coming of helter-skelter, a global race war. He manipulated them so he could take his revenge on the world. He was ready to put his disciples' devotion to deadly use. But could he convince them that something was right, even when they knew it to be wrong? Scientific research reveals that this is not as difficult as it may seem. For more than 5 decades, researchers have been investigating group conformity and how leaders like Manson manipulate their followers. In the 1950s, psychologist Solomon Asch was among the first to examine the power of conformity.
Asch decided he wanted to see whether there was something weird or special about people who followed crazy leaders, or whether you and I, or the average person, under the right circumstances, could be made to conform.
Asch's conformity experiment is legendary among social psychologists like Dr. Benjamin Zablocki.
Afternoon.
It requires no expensive technology. A test subject is placed in a room with a group of actors pretending to be subjects.
Here's Exhibit 1.
They're all shown a pair of cards. The first has a line drawn on it. The second has several lines of different lengths. The test subject is asked to pick the line that matches the one on the first card.
Everyone else, all of the actors who are pretending to be experimental subjects, give the wrong answer.
B.
After all of these actors have given the wrong answer,
B.
the turn comes to
B.
the real experimental subject.
The experiment tests whether the subject will go against the group and answer correctly, or conform and give what he knows is the wrong answer.
It's A.
Initially, many test subjects give the correct answer, but they don't do it easily.
Most people hesitate. They exhibit externally the conflict that's going on inside them between the desire to be a part of the group and the desire to follow the evidence of their own eyes.
But as the experiment proceeds, most subjects begin to go along with the group and give the wrong answer.
A.
The desire to be accepted overcomes the desire to be right.
It's A.
What's found is that 75% of the experimental subjects deny the evidence of their own eyesight and conform or go along with what other people have said. It was not because they had legitimate reason to be unsure, but because they were swept away by this power of conformity to the unanimous group opinion.
Scientists attribute this behavior to a phenomenon known as groupthink.
A.
Cult leaders are able to manipulate their followers by exploiting this basic need and desire to be part of the group. Charles Manson was a master at manipulating his family of followers. And on August the 8th, 1969, he put their devotion to a grisly use. By the summer of 1969, Charles Manson had assembled a group of followers on an isolated ranch in the California desert. The cult included about 24 middle-class kids. Manson was able to manipulate what social psychologists call groupthink to turn these average kids into devoted cult members. Charlie began to preach what he called helter-skelter. It was to be the beginning of an apocalyptic global race war that would bring about the end of the world, with he and his followers emerging as leaders of the survivors.
He'd talk about what's going to happen in the future and things that are going to happen and prophetic things. People killing each other, riots, blacks against whites. It was the mother of all wars that he was talking about, where everyone would just start killing everybody else. I had to believe in him. I had to, because I didn't want to be left behind to die with the rest of the burning cities. I wanted to be one of them that survived. And so everyone there was just wanting to be part of this great thing that was happening. It's a blueprint for every cult that's ever been. Your leader is the only one that has the in with God and knows what's going to go on, and if you don't follow, then you're not going to survive it.
But as the summer of '69 went on, helter-skelter didn't happen. Catherine Scher believes Manson was afraid he would soon lose control of the family.
And why was he going to lose control?
Because if you tell people for 3 straight years that everyone's going to go crazy, and they go to town and people are, you know, going to the movies and going to the beach and having fun, and it's still not happening, if you're wrong about that, maybe you're wrong about everything else.
Right.
And maybe somewhere in his very sick mind, he thought maybe he could start something.
In an effort to spark his predicted race war, Manson targeted affluent white victims. He expected that authorities would blame the murders on African Americans. But Charlie didn't intend to kill the victims himself. On the night of August the 8th, 1969, he dispatched some of his most devoted followers: Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Tex Watson. Manson gave Tex a gun and told him to leave something witchy. Later that weekend, police discovered 7 bodies. When the killers were finally identified months later, America was shocked to learn that they were middle-class hippies.
This was the ultimate goal of all Manson's manipulation and coercion: to shed blood without having to get any of it on his own hands. And he got exactly what he wanted out of his brainwashed followers: more victims to take the fall for his hatred. Manson created a sense that even children who had been raised with traditional values were not safe. And it is this ability to instill such a fear in their families that builds the foundation of his evil.
For Dr. Stone, Manson poses difficult issues.
The Manson case raises the question, to what extent are brainwashed cult followers responsible for their actions? Can people be tricked or manipulated into committing evil acts against their will? Or does evil lie dormant in all of us in varying degrees, until someone like a Charles Manson draws it out?
The summer after the murders, LA County Deputy District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi was preparing to bring Charles Manson to trial. Despite the confession of Susan Atkins and the evidence police had gathered, the case against Manson was problematic.
The problem that I had is that Manson did not physically participate in these murders. He was not present at the time of the murders, so I had to bring him in by way of circumstantial evidence. I looked at this little guy, certainly not an imposing figure, but I immediately knew that it would be a very big mistake on my part if I underestimated him, because he apparently had this unbelievable control over these people to get them to do anything he wanted, including murdering fellow human beings. I needed example after example to show that he completely dominated these people. And at the trial, it became very obvious that Charles Manson, he was the king, the dictatorial ruler of that family.
Even from a closely guarded prison cell, Manson was able to manipulate and dominate his disciples. The groupthink among his loyal followers was as strong as ever. They insisted that Manson was innocent. Susan Atkins refused to testify against him at trial. Of all the young women who fell in with Charles Manson, Barbara Hoyt was one of the few who had been able to break free. Bugliosi realized that Hoyt might be the key to convicting Manson. Hoyt was just 17 years old when she met the cult leader.
I thought he was like magic. I thought he was just an angel. Somebody who could read minds and somebody who understood everything. Because he was so charismatic. He was kind of a pure soul. And he was fun. He was a lot of fun.
Following the Tate and LaBianca murders, Manson retreated to a desert hideout called Barker Ranch. There, Hoyt saw a different side to the cult.
Charlie gathered us up and took us immediately to Barker Ranch, which is a very isolated place in the desert. The family wasn't fun anymore. It became a very fearful place. I didn't know yet about the Tate LaBianca murders.
That was something you became, if not convinced about, at least aware of a little later.
They came in the trailer and told me to turn on the news. And of course, the first story was about the Tate murders. And they laughed. And I thought there was something wrong with me, that I had not X'd myself out of the society very well because it affected me. It really scared me. That's when I heard that these murders had occurred. I did not know that I was sitting amongst the murderers. I had no idea about that until later.
A lot later?
When we're in the desert, at the very end of August, I overheard Sadie telling Ush about the murders and describing the death of Sharon Tate, Abigail Folger, and the LaBianca residents. She said that Sharon Tate cried for her mother, that Abigail Folger had run from the house, and Tex ran over and gutted her, basically.
On the lawn up there, yeah.
And then went back to killing the man. That She told Sharon Tate that she had no mercy for her, called her a bitch, and she didn't care if she was pregnant. And she said, I stabbed her until she stopped screaming.
Could you have been, if you were a little older, indoctrinated to the point where you participated in murder also? Or was there something different about your upbringing, your value system, despite the twisting that it underwent?
The difference, I would think, is that they didn't seem to care about the suffering of the victims. And I did. And it was something I just couldn't fathom, that you could do that.
So your weakness, in quotations, was to be more human than they?
I guess so. Because I just couldn't fathom hurting people like that. I mean, they butchered them.
Yeah.
After I overheard the Tate murders being discussed, I knew I had to get out of there. You know, I really put all my efforts and every bit of my conscious abilities in trying to get out.
Barbara Hoyt, still a naive teenager, is able to break Manson's evil spell. What's fascinating is how Manson's insights into human behavior allowed him to handpick the members who were truly broken down by his relentless manipulation. These individuals were capable of justifying the pain and suffering of others in the name of Manson's cause. But even as a spectator on the ranch, Barbara's moral compass just wouldn't permit such corruption.
Barbara Hoyt escaped Barker Ranch by walking 43 kilometers through the desert. A few weeks later, Manson and the other killers were arrested. Bugliosi saw Hoyt's testimony as a crucial part of his case, but Manson maintained his ruthless control over the family. Hoyt received death threats from the cult, and they demanded she flee to Hawaii.
I always cooperated with the police, but I was very frightened to testify because of all the death threats. I didn't go to Hawaii, as some people said, just to avoid testifying. I was trying to keep them from killing my family.
Manson family member Ruth Ann Morehouse took Hoyt out of town and away from the trial.
I was scared to take the subpoena. I was very frightened to testify. I was constantly being threatened. Your family's going to die. What could be done there could be repeated at your house. I was always threatened. That's why I went with them to Hawaii, because I was afraid they'd hurt my family. So.
Which God knows they were certainly capable of doing.
Yeah.
While the two were traveling in Hawaii, Ruth Ann Morehouse offered Barbara Hoyt a hamburger.
I ate the hamburger, and she said to me as she was getting on the plane, just imagine if there were 10 tabs of acid in that hamburger. I started getting higher and higher, and I couldn't figure out why. And I kept hearing in my head her saying, just imagine if there were 10 tabs of acid on it. Just imagine. It just kind of went over and over and over again in my head. And finally it dawned on me, there were 10 tabs of acid.
It was a potentially lethal dose of LSD.
When I got to the hospital, I told him to call Mr. Bugliosi, because now I'm realizing what's going on. So I started telling everybody my name, my address, my zip code, anything I could think of. I wanted to be identified. I didn't want to be a Jane Doe.
Hoyt recovered, and when she was released from hospital, she immediately returned to Los Angeles.
It was within 2 weeks that I testified. I was not afraid to testify at that point. I was of a single purpose by then. I knew what I needed to do.
But even in the courtroom, Manson tried to control his former family member.
Charlie was trying to get me to answer questions one way, like, say no, like this, say no. And I said, well, yes, because the answer was yes.
Barbara Hoyt's testimony was damning for Manson. From prison, he ordered his followers to proclaim his innocence and demonstrate their devotion to the world.
At the very end, he did everything he could to save his life and get the girls to take on more than they actually did so that he wouldn't get a death penalty. He did not want to go to the gas chamber.
No acts of devotion were too extreme for the family.
And we crawled on our hands and knees all the way from the Sunset Strip to the courthouse. And I didn't think anybody took pictures of it. There I am.
What should be the meaning of that?
To show the devotion that we had to Charles Manson. I mean, it was to the point where, you know, you just do it. There's just no way out.
How can you say that there's no question of his innocence?
Well, the newspapers now are dropping the word alleged. I can say anything I want to say.
You were expected to say certain things, and so you did.
What did you think you were expected to say?
And that he was innocent. We said he was innocence because in our mind he was pure. Whatever he did, he was still innocence.
Beautiful, Charlie. Are you all happy with your court?
Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, they took it upon themselves to try to save Charlie Manson's life and say that he had nothing to do with it.
Right.
This concocted story.
This is essentially what ingrained Manson in the nation's consciousness as such a frightening figure. The sight of so many young girls remaining passionately devoted to a psychopath, even when his depraved and murderous mindset seemed obvious to everyone else. It was clear that he had taken control of some of our children, and that caused fear among everyone who wondered, could this happen in my family?
All my feelings are good.
On January the 25th, 1971, Charles Manson was found guilty of murder. But eerily, he was all smiles.
At the end of the trial, he said to me, Bugliosi, you haven't accomplished anything. He said, all you've done is send me back where I came from. And he was talking about prison. Prison was his life. He was totally institutionalized. When he got out of Terminal Island in 1967, he was 32 years of age. 17 out of those 32 years had been spent in jails, reformatories, and prisons. And I said to him, well, Charlie, that may be true, but you've never been to the green room before. The green room is where they execute people at San Quentin.
3 of the Manson girls were also convicted of murder. Tex Watson was tried and convicted separately. They were all sentenced to death. But in 1972, California abolished the death penalty, and the sentences were commuted to life in prison. Dr. Stone considers whether the convicted murderers are as evil as Manson himself.
Tex Watson oversees the savage massacre ordered by Manson and takes great pleasure in butchering his victims. I rank him at 15 on my scale of evil, a psychopathic, cold-blooded, spree murderer. Susan Atkins gleefully stabbed Sharon Tate. Patricia Krenwinkel displayed brutality and viciousness. They would both also rank at 15 as psychopathic spree killers. Leslie Van Houten is harder to place. While she was convicted of murder, she was not at the Tate scene and did not necessarily inflict any fatal blows. While she certainly helped subdue the LaBiancas and facilitate the crimes, the stab wounds she inflicted on the victims appear to have been committed post-mortem. Therefore, I hold her less accountable and place her at a level 3 on the scale, non-psychopathic, impulsive people who act as willing accomplices with killers.
But judging these murderers is one thing. Judging the man who corrupted them, the killer who's come to personify evil but didn't physically commit the crimes, presents a more difficult challenge. October 1971. Charles Manson, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten had been convicted of murder for the brutal Tate LaBianca killings. These were terrible crimes, masterminded by a brilliant psychopath. But for Dr. Michael Stone, ranking Charles Manson on his scale of evil is a complicated problem.
Manson has come to represent most people's picture of evil, but he himself does not commit the acts of torture and violence necessary to reach the highest level of my scale. Manson's evil acts come in the form of manipulation and control of the people who then do the murdering. The fear he instills to this day would presume a ranking as high as 22, but fear and evil are quite different. He never actually kills the victims in the Tate LaBianca murders. It is for this reason I place Charles Manson at level 15 on my scale of evil, a psychopathic spree murderer.
The guilty verdict didn't end Manson's evil legacy. 2 years after the nightmarish slaughter of 7 innocent victims, the Manson family was as strong as ever. It had expanded beyond its 24 core members as more young people were attracted to Manson and the media spectacle. Even with their leader on death row, true believers on the outside remained fiercely loyal to Manson. Their continued devotion to a crazed murderer only fueled Manson's mystique. The hardcore believers were desperate to free their leader. Several family members were arrested while attempting to rob a gun shop. It was rumored to be the first step in a plot to hijack a plane and trade the hostages for Manson's freedom. Catherine Scher took part in the botched robbery that turned into a shootout with police, but she denies knowing about a planned hijacking.
Were you or were some of the others involved in the idea of hijacking a plane and doing something in order to free Manson?
Well, I was in a shootout with the police. That was a big deal. That I did. I was sitting in a car waiting for them to come out. I got shot in the shoulder.
Right.
And then I went to prison. It's a bad place to be put into.
Yes, indeed.
Most people don't make it out of it.
Right.
I'm just extremely blessed to have a life like this. Most people don't make it out.
There may never be a final tally on the number of people who have fallen prey to Manson and his deranged ideology.
In his ability to detect weaknesses and fears in people and exploit those weaknesses and fears, in my opinion, he was a genius. And that is a precise reason, I think, why people are frightened of Charles Manson more than the average mass murderer. With Manson, since he could get other people to kill for him, the fright is exponential, and therefore he becomes much more dangerous.
No one likes to admit they could be brainwashed by someone like Charles Manson.
A lot of people feel that I would never have gone for that. I'm too smart for that. But it wasn't just some crazed out acid heads. It was people from all stratospheres. It was college kids and middle class kids. So it was a lot of different people from different backgrounds.
Manson is now in his 70s and remains behind bars, but he retains some of his power. He continues to attract and manipulate the desperate and naive. He serves as an icon for hate groups and receives more letters than any other prison inmate. Each new recruit is a reason to continue to fear Manson.
Manson's notoriety has catapulted him into an exalted place, if one can use such a word, in the ranks of serial killers. Other murderers since Manson have molded themselves on his example. His extraordinary ability, not just to brainwash people, but to spot weaknesses in them that led them to carry out Manson's evil intentions, was the quality that places him in a special category of evil. For almost 4 decades, Manson has been confined to his jail cell, an icon for those with a grudge against society. This is why Manson continues to terrify us. This is what makes him most evil.